On the day of my wife's sister's wedding, I found my photo at the gate with a sign, "Do not let the poor in-law in." I turned and left in silence. For hours later, she realized her wedding had ended. When I went home, so there I was, pulling up to what had to be the most Instagram-perfect wedding venue in the entire tri-state area. I'm talking about one of those places that charge you $50 just to breathe their artisanal oxygen. White tents stretched under these massive oak trees that probably cost more to maintain than my annual salary. And there was this stone archway absolutely drowning in roses that looked like they'd been individually blessed by Martha Stewart herself. The whole setup screamed, "We have more money than sense," which, knowing my in-laws, was pretty much their family motto. This was Talia's big day, my wife Sophie's younger sister, the golden child who could literally set fire to an orphanage and still get praised for her creative spirit. I'd been mentally preparing for this circus for months, and honestly, I was ready to play my part. Help set up chairs, carry things, smile at distant relatives who'd inevitably ask what I do for work, with that special tone reserved for people they suspect might not own a yacht. I straightened my jacket, the good one I'd bought specifically for this event, because God forbid I show up in something from Target, and took a deep breath. The place smelled like expensive perfume, and that particular brand of entitlement that comes with having a trust fund. Guests were already floating around like they were auditioning for a Real Housewives episode, all polished shoes and designer handbags that cost more than my car payment. And that's when I spotted Leo, the security guard they'd hired for the event. Now, Leo seemed like a decent enough guy, the kind of working-class dude who probably thought this whole production was as ridiculous as I did. But when he stepped directly into my path, clipboard in hand, I knew something was off. The way he looked at me, like he was about to deliver the world's most uncomfortable news, made my stomach drop. "Sorry, sir," he said, and I could tell he really was sorry. Poor bastard was just doing his job. Then he pointed to his clipboard, and I swear to God, time slowed down like I was in some twisted movie scene. There, clipped to the top of his official wedding security paperwork, was my photograph. Not a good one, either. It looked like they'd pulled it from my Facebook profile, the one where I'm squinting because Sophie took it right after I'd been staring at my phone screen for 3 hours. But the photo wasn't the worst part. Oh no, that honor belonged to the text underneath it, printed in bold, unmistakable letters. "Do not let the poor in-law in." For a moment, I honestly thought I was hallucinating. Maybe I'd had a stroke in the parking lot. Maybe this was some elaborate prank, and someone was going to jump out with a camera and tell me I'd been punked. But Leo's increasingly uncomfortable expression told me this was real. This was actually happening. The silence that followed was the kind you only experience right before a tornado hits. Even the birds seemed to shut up, like Mother Nature herself was holding her breath to see how this train wreck would unfold. Meanwhile, guests continued their elegant parade past us, wrapped in clouds of perfume that probably cost more per ounce than gold. A few of them glanced in my direction, took in the scene. Me standing there like an idiot, Leo clutching his clipboard like a life preserver, and then quickly looked away with that practiced indifference rich people use when they encounter anything unpleasant. That my brain was still trying to process what I was seeing when muscle memory kicked in. I pulled out my phone and called Sophie, because surely this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe someone had mixed up the clipboards. Maybe this was meant for some other poor in-law. Though honestly, what kind of family has multiple poor in-laws they need to ban from weddings? "Sophie," I said when she picked up, and I could hear the sound of champagne glasses clinking and people laughing in the background. "There's been some kind of mix-up here. The security guard has my picture with instructions not to let me in because I'm the poor in-law." There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds too long. 3 seconds that told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. "Marcus," she whispered, and I could tell she was trying to move somewhere more private. "Please don't start. Today is not about you. Not about me." I was staring at my own face on a blacklist, and somehow this wasn't about me. But before I could even begin to unpack that particular piece of logic, she hung up. Just like that. Click. Dial tone. End of conversation. I stood there for another moment, phone still pressed to my ear like maybe she'd call back and explain that this was all some hilarious misunderstanding. Like maybe she'd say, "Oh my God, Marcus, I can't believe my family is this stupid. Come in, we'll fix this right now." But that call didn't come. Instead, I got to taste that metallic flavor that fills your mouth right before you either throw up or punch something. It's the taste of humiliation mixed with rage, seasoned with a generous helping of disbelief. I'd experienced it before, usually during family dinners when my father-in-law would make his little comments about people who work with their hands, or when my mother-in-law would ask if I was still doing that little job of yours. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was calculated. Someone had taken the time to print out my picture, write those words, and attach it to official wedding security instructions. Someone had looked at my face and decided I wasn't worthy of being in the same space as their precious guests. That I looked at Leo, who was clearly wishing he was anywhere else in the world. Poor guy was probably making minimum wage to deal with this kind of rich people drama. I nodded at him, not his fault, just following orders, and said, "No worries, man. I get it." And then I did something that probably shocked everyone who knew me. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I didn't demand to speak to the manager or threaten to call my lawyer. I just turned around, walked back to my car with as much dignity as I could muster, and drove away. Very, very calmly. Because sometimes, when people show you exactly who they are, the best thing you can do is believe them. And what my wife's family had just shown me was that they considered me such a liability, such an embarrassment, that they'd rather ban me from the wedding than risk having their guests see me and realize they'd let their daughter marry down. Well, message received, loud and clear as I drove away from that perfect venue with its perfect tints and perfect roses. I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Because for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I stood with these people. And it turned out, I didn't stand anywhere at all. The drive home was one of those weird, out-of-body experiences where you're going through the motions of normal life while your brain is basically screaming into the void. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, maintained a respectable speed, used my turn signals like a law-abiding citizen, all while replaying the last few months in my head like some masochistic highlight reel. See, here's the thing about being the poor in-law that nobody talks about. You become invisible in the most spectacular way possible. You're there, you're helping, you're doing stuff, but somehow it all gets attributed to family effort or everyone pitching in. It's like being a ghost who pays bills and moves furniture. Take last month, for instance. Margaret, that's my delightful mother-in-law, had called me at 7 in the morning, practically hyperventilating because the rental company had screwed up the table delivery. Did she call her precious daughter Talia? Nope. Did she call her husband Harlan, who supposedly knows people in the event business? Hell no. She called me, because somehow I'd become the family's unofficial crisis manager, so there I was, spending my Saturday morning driving to 3 different rental places, sweet-talking managers, and basically performing miracles to make sure Princess Talia had the exact shade of ivory table she'd seen in some wedding magazine. And when I finally got it sorted, Margaret told everyone at dinner that she'd handled the table situation. Like I was just the Uber driver who happened to be in the area. Or how about the time 2 weeks ago when the photographer's backup equipment got stolen from his car? Guess who got the panicked phone call at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday? Not the bride's wealthy parents who could have easily covered new equipment. Me. Because apparently, I'm the go-to guy for small emergencies, which is rich people speak for problems that require actual money and effort to solve. I'd driven across town to meet Hollis Reed, the photographer, at a 24-hour camera shop, helped him pick out replacement gear, and put it on my credit card because his insurance wouldn't kick in until the next week. Did anyone thank me at the family dinner that Sunday? Well, Harlan did mention that the photography situation had been handled smoothly, which I guess was his way of acknowledging my existence without actually acknowledging my existence. The really beautiful part was the suit situation. 3 weeks ago, Harlan had called me in a panic because his tuxedo rental was all wrong. Apparently, the place had given him something more appropriate for a prom in 1987 than his daughter's wedding. So naturally, I dropped everything, picked him up, and spent 4 hours driving around to different formal wear places until we found something that met his standards. 4 hours. On a workday, which meant I had to use vacation time to help my father-in-law not look like a reject from a bad romantic comedy. And the whole time he's going on about how these service people don't understand quality, how back in his day, you could count on businesses to get things right the first time. The irony of him complaining about service while I was literally providing him with unpaid chauffeur and personal shopping services was apparently lost on him. But it wasn't just the big stuff. It was the endless parade of small favors that added up to me basically being their unpaid personal assistant. Emergency hotel bookings when their out-of-town guests realized that staying in Manhattan during wedding season was going to cost them more than a small car. Backup transportation when the shuttle service tried to jack up their prices at the last minute. Hell, I'd even paid for Margaret's hair and makeup trial runs because the salon required a deposit and she'd forgotten her wallet. Every single time, it was the same story. Marcus is so resourceful. They'd say, like being resourceful was some kind of charming personality quirk instead of code for the guy who solves our problems with his own money and time. I wasn't resourceful. I was their safety net, the person they could count on to catch whatever expensive problem came falling down. And the whole time, they'd make these little comments. Nothing directly insulting. Mind you, they were too classy for that. Just these casual observations about how different our backgrounds were, how interesting it must be for me to experience their world, how lucky Sophie was that I was so adaptable. Every conversation was a masterclass in passive-aggressive condescension disguised as inclusion. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd mentally cataloged every single thing I'd done for this wedding over the past year. The running around, the emergency fixes, the deposits, the favors, the smile and nod sessions while they talked about me like I was some fascinating anthropological specimen they'd decided to adopt. That I sat in my car for a minute, staring at my house. My normal, middle-class house in my normal, middle-class neighborhood where nobody gave a damn about the thread count of your sheets or whether your watch was expensive enough to be taken seriously. It looked pretty good right about now. Inside, I went straight to my office and called Monique Alvarez, my accountant. Monique was one of those no-nonsense women who could make sense of any financial mess and wasn't impressed by anyone's family drama. If you wanted straight answers about money, she was your person. Marcus, she said when she picked up, please tell me you're not calling about more wedding expenses. I'm starting to think you're funding this thing single-handedly. Actually, Monique, I need you to run through the final balances for everything we've got tied up in this wedding. I could hear her pulling up files on her computer. Oh boy. Okay, let's see what we're looking at here. She started reading down the list, and with each item, I felt this weird sense of clarity washing over me. Chef Anton Catering. I'd covered their deposit when the family's check bounced, and they needed to secure the booking. Hollis Reed Photography. That was the equipment replacement plus his retainer fee. Priya Kapoor Floral. I'd paid her rush fee when Talia decided 3 days before the wedding that she needed completely different centerpieces. Then there was Jasper Miles and the Night Owls, the band that was supposed to keep everyone dancing until midnight. Bluebell Transit for the shuttle service. The venue's closing balance with manager Ms. Duarte. The temporary event liquor license that was, for reasons I still didn't understand, filed under my name. And the generator fuel on my commercial account with Oscar Power Services, because apparently, the venue's backup power wasn't reliable enough for the precious celebration. All deposits are paid, Monique continued, and final payments are scheduled for Monday on your authorization. Insurance binder is issued through your policy, generator fuel account is active, and the liquor license expires Tuesday. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time all day, I smiled. Not a happy smile. More like the smile you get when you suddenly understand the punchline to a really dark joke. Monique, I said, I need you to pause all my authorizations. Every single one. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Pause them. Marcus, the wedding is today. If anyone asks why, tell them to speak to the bride's family. They made it very clear today that my presence isn't welcome at their celebration. I could practically hear her raising an eyebrow. What did they do? Let's just say they've decided I'm not their kind of people. Got it. Consider everything paused. You want me to send notifications? Just to the vendors. Let them know authorization has been withdrawn and they need to contact the bride's family for payment arrangements. After I hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, looking out at my backyard where everything was exactly as messy and imperfect as real life should be. And then I waited for the silence to do its work. I grabbed a notebook from my desk drawer, one of those composition books I used to use for project planning back when I thought being organized would somehow earn me respect in this family. The irony wasn't lost on me. I opened it to a fresh page and started writing down numbers, because sometimes you need to see the full picture laid out in black and white before you can really grasp just how spectacular your situation has become. The thing about being the family's unofficial problem solver is that you start keeping track of stuff without even realizing it. Not because you're planning to use it against anyone, but because when you're the person everyone calls when things go sideways, you develop this weird mental filing system. You remember dates, amounts, who said what, who promised what, and who conveniently forgot what. So I started with the obvious stuff, the big-ticket items that Monique had just run through with me. But then I kept going, digging deeper into the rabbit hole of small favors that had somehow become my second job over the past year. There was Harlan's tux situation, which hadn't just been about finding a replacement. No, that would have been too simple. After we'd spent 4 hours finding the perfect formal wear, he'd mentioned, casually, like it was no big deal, that he was a little short on the rental fee because he'd had some unexpected expenses that month. Translation: he'd blown his discretionary income on something stupid and needed me to cover his clothing for his own daughter's wedding. $650, because apparently, when you're playing the part of distinguished father of the bride, you can't just rent any old tux. Then there was Margaret's beauty situation. The hair and makeup trials weren't just about finding the right look. They were about finding the right look at the right salon that met her impossibly specific standards. We're talking about a woman who returned a perfectly good lipstick because the shade was too optimistic for her complexion. 3 different salons, 5 different trial runs, and every time I was the one putting down the deposit because they required payment up front, and she always seemed to be between credit card cycles or some other conveniently timed financial hiccup. But here's where it gets really good. The backup tent. 3 weeks before the wedding, there'd been some weather report about possible storms, and suddenly Margaret was having visions of her precious outdoor ceremony getting rained out. Never mind that the venue had covered areas and contingency plans. She needed a backup tent. Not just any tent, mind you, but one that would complement the aesthetic vision and not look like we were hosting a carnival. So I'd spent 2 days calling around to rental companies, comparing prices, checking availability, and eventually putting down a deposit on a tent that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A tent that, as it turned out, was never needed because the weather was perfect. Did I get that deposit back? Well, technically yes, but only after I agreed to let them keep a cancellation fee that was basically highway robbery with a bow on top. The emergency hotel situation was another masterpiece of family logistics. Apparently, when you're planning a wedding in the New York area and you don't book accommodations until the last minute, you discover that hotel prices during peak wedding season are approximately equivalent to the cost of a small space mission. Who knew? So when their out-of-town relatives started calling in a panic because they couldn't find anywhere to stay that wouldn't require them to take out a second mortgage, guess who got to play travel agent? I'd spent an entire weekend calling hotels, negotiating rates, and putting blocks of rooms on my credit card because the relatives couldn't guarantee their arrivals and hotels wanted secured bookings. 6 rooms at the Marriott, 4 at the Hampton Inn, and 2 suites at some boutique place that Margaret insisted was more appropriate for family than the perfectly fine chain hotels I'd originally found. 12 rooms total, 3 nights each, all guaranteed on my personal credit because heaven forbid the precious relatives should have to deal with the stress of securing their own accommodations. Then there was the shuttle service drama. The original company they'd booked had tried to jack up their prices 2 weeks before the wedding, claiming there'd been some kind of miscommunication about the distance and timing. Classic bait-and-switch nonsense, except instead of telling them to pound sand and finding a different company, the family had just assumed I'd handle it, which I did, because apparently, I'm an idiot with a hero complex. I'd negotiated with 3 different transportation companies, compared routes and timing, and ultimately booked with Bluebell Transit because they offered the best combination of reliability and cost. Of course, they required a 50% deposit up front, and of course, the family was temporarily cash poor due to other wedding expenses. The beautiful part was that none of this stuff ever got discussed at family dinners or planning meetings. It all happened in private phone calls and emergency texts, like some kind of shadow wedding that was running parallel to the official celebration. The official version was all about flower arrangements and seating charts and whether the string quartet should play Pachelbel or something more contemporary during the processional. The unofficial version, my version, was about making sure there was enough backup power to keep the lights on, enough transportation to get everyone where they needed to go, and enough contingency planning to handle every possible disaster that might threaten the perfect day they'd all been imagining. That I wrote it all down, every number, every favor, every time I dropped everything to solve someone else's problem. The running total was honestly staggering, not just in terms of money, but in terms of time and effort and sheer emotional labor. I'd basically been moonlighting as an unpaid wedding planner for the past year, handling all the boring, stressful, expensive stuff while they got to focus on the fun parts. And the whole time, they'd been making their little jokes about me being the resourceful one, the guy who could always figure something out, the person they could count on to handle whatever came up. They'd made it sound like some kind of charming character trait, like I was just naturally good at solving problems instead of being someone who'd been systematically recruited to solve their problems. Looking at the numbers laid out in my notebook, I realized something that should have been obvious months ago. I wasn't planning revenge here. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone or teach them some kind of lesson. I was just tired of being taken for granted, tired of being the family's emergency contact for anything that required actual work or actual money. If I wasn't welcome as a person, if my presence was so embarrassing that they needed to post my picture at the gate like I was some kind of security threat, then my wallet wasn't welcome either. It was really that simple. That I wasn't asking for gratitude or recognition or even basic respect. I was just stepping back from a dynamic that had turned me into the family's unpaid staff member. If they wanted to treat me like hired help, they could start by actually hiring help. I finished writing down the last few numbers and closed the notebook. Then I started drafting some very polite emails to the vendors, because there's something to be said for maintaining your dignity even when you're pulling the plug on someone else's perfect day. The funny thing about being the invisible man at a wedding is that you get to see how everything really works behind the scenes. While everyone else is obsessing over flower arrangements and whether the bridesmaids' dresses are the right shade of blush, you're dealing with the nuts and bolts that actually make the whole production possible. You learn about permits and insurance policies and backup generators, the unglamorous stuff that keeps the party running but never gets mentioned in the thank you speeches. When I decided to step back from my role as the family's unpaid logistics coordinator, I knew exactly which switches to flip. And the beautiful thing was, I didn't have to do anything dramatic or vindictive. I just had to stop doing things. Sometimes the most powerful action you can take is simply not acting. I settled into my kitchen chair with my laptop and started sending out what had to be the most polite, go screw yourselves messages in the history of wedding planning. Nothing nasty, nothing petty, just straightforward business communications letting people know that authorization had changed hands. Professional courtesy at its finest. The first email went to Ms. Duarte, the venue manager, a woman who'd been dealing with bridezillas and their families for probably longer than I'd been alive. She knew the drill. Weddings bring out the worst in people, and vendor payments are usually the first casualty when family drama starts flying. Dear Ms. Duarte, I typed, effective immediately, please direct all authorization requests and final payment arrangements to the bride's family. My role in the financial oversight of this event has concluded. Thank you for your professionalism throughout this process. Short, sweet, and about as diplomatic as a nuclear weapon. Then I moved on to the catering situation. Chef Anton had been a pleasure to work with, the kind of guy who actually understood that feeding 200 people without poisoning anyone requires precision, planning, and payment up front. His deposit had been sitting in limbo for 2 months while the family debated whether they wanted the salmon or the chicken, and I'd been the one guaranteeing that he'd get paid regardless of their indecision. Chef Anton, I wrote, please coordinate all remaining payments and final arrangements directly with the bride's family. My authorization for catering expenses has been withdrawn. I'm confident you'll provide excellent service as always. I hit send and immediately felt this weird sense of lightness, like I'd just set down a suitcase I'd been carrying for way too long. The band was next. Jasper Miles and the Night Owls were supposed to keep everyone dancing until midnight, assuming someone actually paid them. Jazz musicians aren't exactly known for their flexible payment terms, and Jasper had made it clear from the beginning that the final balance needed to be settled before they'd start setting up equipment. Hi Jasper, I typed, hope you and the band are ready for a great show tonight. Please note that all payment coordination should now go through the bride's family directly. My financial involvement has ended. Break a leg out there. By the time I finished working through my vendor list, it was already past 3 in the afternoon. The wedding ceremony was supposed to start at 4, which meant people were probably already arriving at the venue, finding their seats, checking their phones for those perfect pre-ceremony selfies. The bride was probably in her getting-ready suite, surrounded by bridesmaids and champagne, and all the nervous excitement that comes with thinking your wedding day is going to be the most perfect day of your life. That's when my phone started buzzing. 3:20 p.m. Ms. Duarte, sounding slightly panicked. Mr. Marcus, we need to refresh the insurance binder before we can open the dance floor for the reception. The policy expires at 6 p.m., and we need updated coverage for the evening events. I listened to her voicemail and felt that same weird sense of calm I'd experienced driving away from the venue. Ms. Duarte, I called back. My insurance coverage for this event has been withdrawn. You'll need to coordinate new coverage with the bride's family. There was a pause that lasted about 3 heartbeats too long. Sir, are you certain? We can't operate the reception without proper insurance coverage. I'm absolutely certain. Have a lovely day. 3:40 p.m. Text from the bar manager, a guy named Rick who'd been dealing with wedding booze drama for probably 20 years. Hey Marcus, your name is on the liquor permit as the responsible party. Just confirming everything's still valid for tonight's service? I texted back. Authorization withdrawn. Contact bride's family for new permit arrangements. My phone immediately rang. Dude, what do you mean withdrawn? We can't serve alcohol without a valid permit, and yours is the only one on file. That's correct, I said. You'll need a new permit from someone else. But the ceremony starts in 20 minutes. Yes, it does. Good luck with that. 3:55 p.m. Oscar from the generator company, calling from what sounded like the cab of his truck. Marcus, my man, just pulling up to the venue now. Fuel release is on your account, right? Want to make sure we're good to go before I start the hookup. Actually, Oscar, that account authorization has been canceled. You'll need to get payment approval from someone else. Canceled? Today? Brother, I've got a truck full of diesel and a crew ready to set up. You can't just cancel on the day of the event. I'm not canceling anything, I said. I'm just no longer authorizing payment. There's a difference. I could hear him muttering something that probably wasn't appropriate for mixed company. So what am I supposed to do with this fuel? I'd suggest talking to the people who actually wanted the generator. Have a good one, Oscar. By 4:10 p.m., the dominoes were starting to fall in exactly the way I'd expected. When you've been the invisible backbone of an operation for long enough, you develop a pretty clear understanding of how quickly things can unravel when that backbone suddenly disappears. The bar closing was the first real sign that my little paper revolution was working. Nothing dramatic, just Rick putting up a discreet sign and starting to pack away bottles. Can't serve alcohol without a permit, and getting a new permit on a Saturday afternoon is about as likely as finding a unicorn that does taxes. 4:18 p.m. My phone buzzed with a text from Jasper. Got word we need to hold off on setup until payment situation gets sorted. Band's staying ready, but equipment stays in the truck for now. Perfect. Musicians are smart that way. They've been screwed over by enough wedding planners to know that promises don't pay rent. No payment authorization means no music, which means no dancing, which means the reception just became a very expensive dinner party with increasingly awkward silences. 4:26 p.m. Ms. Duarte again, this time sounding like she was dealing with a full-scale emergency. Mr. Marcus, the family is saying they need time to arrange new payment methods. Can you give us any kind of temporary authorization just to get through the evening? I'm afraid not, I said. My involvement in this event has ended. Sir, we have 200 guests expecting a full reception. The cake cutting is scheduled for 6 p.m. That sounds like something the people who plan this reception should handle. By 4:30, the wind had picked up enough to make the white tent flap like a surrender flag, which felt appropriate. Through my kitchen window, I could see my neighbor mowing his lawn, completely oblivious to the 5-alarm wedding emergency that was probably unfolding about 20 miles away. I made myself another cup of tea and settled in to wait for the phone calls I knew were coming. Because when you've been the family's emergency solution for as long as I had, people tend to assume you'll always be available to save the day. They were about to learn that assumption had just become spectacularly wrong. The first call came at exactly 4:37 p.m., and I knew it was Sophie before I even looked at the caller ID. There's something about the timing of panic that's completely predictable. It takes about 27 minutes for wedding chaos to filter up from the vendors, to the venue management, to the wedding planner, to the family. And then someone finally remembers that maybe they should call the guy whose name is on all the paperwork. When I answered, the noise hit me like a physical force. It wasn't just conversation. It was that particular brand of barely controlled chaos that happens when a large group of well-dressed people suddenly realizes their expensive party is falling apart in real time. I could hear chairs scraping against the ground, multiple conversations happening at volume levels that suggested panic, and what sounded like someone crying in the background. "What did you do?" Sophie shouted, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear because she was practically screaming. "Marcus, what the hell did you do? They're saying we can't serve anything. The band is packing up their equipment. The bar is closed. The venue manager is asking for a credit card that we don't have, and everyone keeps saying they need your confirmation for everything. What is happening?" I took a sip of my tea and looked out at my perfectly quiet street, where the most dramatic thing happening was Mrs. Chun walking her little terrier. The contrast was almost surreal. Total chaos 20 miles away, complete peace in my kitchen. "Well," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured, "about 4 hours ago, I arrived at your sister's wedding venue where I discovered that someone had printed out my photograph and attached it to security instructions with the words, 'Do not let the poor in line,' written underneath it. So I respected that boundary. I left. And since I'm apparently not welcome as a person, I figured my money probably wasn't welcome either." There was a moment of silence on Sophie's end, which was impressive considering the level of noise in the background. Then she came back with what had to be the most tone-deaf response in the history of marital communication. "Marcus, you're being ridiculous. That was it wasn't meant to be taken seriously. You know how my family is with their jokes. You can't punish everyone because you got your feelings hurt." Got my feelings hurt. Like I was some oversensitive child who couldn't take a joke instead of a grown man who'd just been publicly humiliated by his own in-laws. "Sophie," I said, "putting someone's picture on a blacklist isn't a joke. It's a decision, and I'm simply responding to that decision by making one of my own. But people are asking about insurance and permits and payments, and no one knows what to do. I'd suggest they figure it out the same way they figured out how to make that sign." That's when the volume on her end went up another notch, and I realized she was probably standing in the middle of the reception area where everyone could hear her side of the conversation. Perfect. Nothing like having your family drama broadcast to 200 wedding guests. "Marcus, please," she said, and now there was real desperation in her voice. "Just turn everything back on. We can talk about this later. Just fix this so Talia can have her wedding." "Talia is having her wedding," I said. "She's just not having the wedding that I was paying for." That's when she hung up on me. Again. Apparently, hanging up on people was the family's go-to conflict resolution strategy. That MY phone was quiet for exactly 6 minutes before it started ringing again. This time it was Talia, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Between the sobs and the hiccups, I managed to piece together something about how I was ruining the most important day of her life. And how could I be so cruel? And didn't I understand that this was her wedding? "Talia," I said gently, because despite everything, I didn't actually hate the kid. "I'm not ruining your wedding. Your wedding ended for me the moment someone decided I wasn't good enough to attend it." "But Marcus," she sobbed, "it wasn't my idea. I didn't know about the sign. Mom and Dad handled all the security stuff." Which was interesting, because it meant she was willing to throw her parents under the bus to save her reception, but she wasn't willing to actually do anything about the situation. Like maybe calling her parents and telling them to fix what they'd broken. "I understand it wasn't your idea," I said, "but it was someone's idea, and that someone is responsible for dealing with the consequences. You have to fix this. The cake cutting is in an hour, and there's no music, and people are asking what's wrong," and that's when the phone got grabbed away from her, because suddenly I was listening to Margaret's voice. And she was using that particular tone that rich white women deploy when they're talking to someone they consider beneath them but need something from. "Marcus," she said, like she was addressing a particularly slow child, "I don't know what kind of tantrum you think you're throwing, but this is neither the time nor the place. You are being incredibly selfish, and you need to stop this nonsense immediately." Tantrum, nonsense, selfish, the holy trinity of condescending dismissal. "Margaret," I said, I'm sitting in my kitchen drinking tea. I'm not throwing anything. I'm simply not funding an event where I'm not welcome. Don't be dramatic. It was a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. A misunderstanding, I repeated. Someone printed my picture, wrote, "Do not let the poor-in-law in" underneath it, and gave it to security. That's a pretty specific misunderstanding. It was meant to be humorous. Humor, I said, is supposed to be funny. This was just cruel. You're punishing everyone because you can't take a joke. And there it was. The same argument Sophie had tried. The same complete inability to understand that what they'd done wasn't a harmless prank, but a deliberate humiliation. They genuinely seemed to believe that as long as they called it a joke, they could say or do whatever they wanted without consequences. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm simply not subsidizing people who think it's funny to put a slur under my picture. There's a difference. A slur? Don't you think you're being a little overdramatic? Margaret, what would you call it when someone posts a sign saying, "Don't let the poor-in-law in"? I'd call it a family joke that you're taking way too seriously. I looked out my window again, where everything was still perfectly normal and quiet. Mr. Rodriguez was washing his car. A couple of kids were riding bikes down the sidewalk. Normal people living normal lives. Not one of them worried about whether they were poor enough to be banned from family events. You know what, Margaret? You're absolutely right. It is a family joke. And now the family gets to figure out how funny it really is. I could hear her saying something else, probably about how unreasonable I was being, but I'd stopped listening. Instead, I was thinking about all the times over the past year when I dropped everything to solve their problems. All the times they'd called me resourceful, when what they really meant was useful. All the casual comments about my background and my job and my different perspective on things, they'd made their position clear. I was the poor in-law, someone to be tolerated but not respected, someone whose money was welcome but whose presence was embarrassing. Well, message received. And my response was equally clear. If I wasn't good enough to be family, I wasn't going to keep paying to pretend I was. The phone was still squawking in my ear, but I was done listening to explanations about family jokes and misunderstandings. I'd heard all I needed to hear. Margaret, I said, cutting her off mid-sentence, I hope you have a lovely evening figuring out how to fund the rest of this celebration. I'm sure it'll be educational. And then I hung up, turned off my phone, and went to make myself a sandwich. Because apparently, I was going to miss dinner. The rest of the evening was blissfully quiet. I turned my phone off after the Margaret conversation, made myself a decent sandwich, and settled in to watch a baseball game like it was any other Saturday night. The Yankees were playing the Red Sox, which seemed appropriate. Sometimes you just need to watch someone else's rivalry to put your own family drama in perspective. Around 7:30, I started hearing text notifications pinging on my silenced phone, but I ignored them. Whatever crisis was unfolding at the wedding venue, they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome to be part of the solution. So I wasn't going to torture myself by following the play-by-play of their disaster. I was just settling into the 8th inning when headlights swept across my front windows. Not unusual, my neighbors come and go at all hours. But then the lights didn't move on. They just sat there, pointing at my house like spotlights at a prison break that I looked out through the blinds and had to blink a couple of times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. There, lined up on my front walk like some kind of formal delegation, stood Sophie, Talia, Margaret, Harlan, and Jonah. The groom himself, still in his tuxedo, but looking like he'd been through a blender. Hair wilted, makeup smeared, eyes red from what I assumed was a combination of crying and sheer frustration. They looked like refugees from an expensive disaster, which I guess is exactly what they were. I took my time getting to the door. No point in rushing. They'd obviously driven all the way over here, so they could wait another 30 seconds while I decided how I wanted to handle this little intervention. Through the peephole, I could see them trying to organize themselves into some kind of formation, like they were planning a military operation instead of a conversation. When I finally opened the door, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not bad smells, exactly, but the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with wedding cake, and that particular brand of desperation that comes from watching your perfect day implode in real time. Talia was still in her wedding dress, which had to be uncomfortable as hell, and there were grass stains on the hem that suggested she'd been doing some serious problem-solving in high heels. "Marcus," Harlan said, stepping forward like he'd been elected spokesperson for the group. He was trying for his usual authoritative tone, but there was something deflated about him, like someone had let the air out of his normal pompousness. "We need to talk." "Apparently so," I said, not moving from the doorway. "What can I do for you folks?" Sophie shot me a look that could have frozen hell over. "Don't be like that. You know why we're here." "Actually, I don't. Last time I checked, I wasn't welcome at family events." Something about being the poor in-law. That's when Talia stepped forward, still sniffling, still in full bridal regalia. "Marcus, please. I know what happened was wrong, but you're punishing everyone for something that wasn't my fault. This is my wedding day." I corrected gently. "This was your wedding day. And technically, you had a wedding. You got married, right? Congratulations." Jonah, poor bastard, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Getting married is stressful enough without having your reception collapse because your new in-laws decided to humiliate the guy who was secretly funding the whole thing. "Look, Marcus," he said, "I don't really understand all the family stuff that's going on here. But is there any way we can work this out? Just for tonight." I had to give him credit for trying, but he was missing the fundamental point. "Jonah, this isn't a negotiation. This isn't something that can be worked out with the right combination of apologies and promises. Your new family decided I wasn't good enough to attend your wedding. I'm respecting that decision. But the vendors," Margaret said, jumping in with that exasperated tone she used when people weren't following her perfectly logical instructions. "They're all saying they need your authorization. Surely you can just call them and turn everything back on." "I could," I agreed. "But I won't. Because the same people who thought it was funny to ban me from the wedding are now asking me to pay for it. Do you see the problem with that?" Harlan tried his diplomatic approach next. "Marcus, we understand you're upset. And we can fix this situation if you just help us get through tonight. We can sit down tomorrow and work out whatever issues you have with how things were handled." I leaned against my doorframe and really looked at them. This collection of people who'd spent the last year treating me like their personal ATM and errand boy, now standing on my porch looking like they'd been hit by a tornado. It was almost funny, in a dark, twisted way. "Harlan," I said, "I have one question for you. Just one. Who printed that sign?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear a dog barking 3 blocks away. They all looked at each other like they were playing some kind of reverse hot potato, hoping someone else would be the one to admit what everyone already knew. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat. It was meant to be a joke that got out of hand." "A joke," I repeated. "Someone sat down at a computer, typed out those words, printed them, and attached my photograph to security instructions as a joke." "Marcus," Sophie said, "you're making this into something bigger than it was. You know my family didn't mean anything malicious by it." "Your family," I said, "made a blacklist with my face on it. They handed it to security. They told a working man to keep me out because I'm poor. How exactly am I supposed to interpret that as anything other than malicious?" Talia started crying again, which I felt bad about, but not bad enough to change my position. "You're ruining everything," she sobbed. "This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life." "Talia," I said as gently as I could, "I didn't ruin anything. I left quietly when I was told I wasn't welcome. Everything that happened after that is the consequence of decisions your family made without thinking them through." "But you could fix it," she insisted. "You could call everyone right now and turn everything back on and save the reception." "I could," I agreed. "But here's the thing. I spent the last year doing things for this family. Moving furniture, solving problems, paying deposits, handling emergencies. I did all of that because I thought I was part of the family. But today I found out that I'm not family. I'm just the guy who pays for stuff." "That's not true," Sophie said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? When was the last time anyone in this family asked how I was doing? When was the last time anyone thanked me for handling one of your emergencies? When was the last time anyone treated me like I mattered for something other than my ability to solve problems and write checks?" They didn't have an answer for that, which was answer enough. "Look," I continued, "I'm not trying to be vindictive here. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm just tired of being taken for granted, and I'm especially tired of being insulted by people who expect me to keep helping them. If you want my presence, you get me as a person. If you want my money, you treat me with respect. You can't have it both ways. So what do you want?" Harlan asked. "An apology? I want you to imagine," I said, "that none of this had anything to do with me. Imagine that you're planning a wedding and you need to pay vendors and get permits and handle logistics. Imagine that you're adults who can solve problems without calling someone you've just publicly humiliated. We stood there looking at each other for a long moment, and I could see the exact moment when they realized I wasn't going to budge. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a temporary tantrum that could be managed with the right combination of pressure and promises. This was me drawing a line and meaning it. After they left, deflated, defeated, and still dressed in their wedding finery, I turned my phone back on and immediately regretted it. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and what appeared to be several voicemails that I wasn't emotionally prepared to listen to. The digital equivalent of a 5-alarm fire, all because I decided to stop being the family's unpaid crisis management service that I was scrolling through the messages, most of which seemed to follow the same basic template of "call me back immediately," mixed with varying degrees of panic and indignation when my phone rang again. The caller ID showed Lydia Chun, Sophie's cousin who worked at some big bank in Manhattan. Lydia was one of those family members who existed on the periphery of the drama, close enough to know what was happening but smart enough to stay out of the line of fire. "Marcus," she said when I picked up, and her voice had that careful, quiet quality that people use when they're about to drop a bomb they know is going to cause massive damage. "I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise me you won't say where you heard this." "Okay," I said, settling back into my kitchen chair because something about her tone told me I was going to want to be sitting down for this conversation. "I was at the wedding," she continued, "and I heard Margaret and Harlan talking during the cocktail hour, before everything went sideways. They were standing near the bar, and I guess they thought no one was listening, but you know how sound carries in those tents." I waited, because Lydia was the kind of person who told stories in her own time, in her own way, and rushing her would just make everything take longer. "They were talking about you," she said. "About the plan for after the speeches." "The plan? Marcus, they weren't just being cruel with that sign. They were setting you up. The whole thing. The poor in-law comment, making you feel unwelcome, all of it. It was deliberate. They wanted you feeling guilty and defensive so that when they made their move later, you'd be more likely to say yes." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What move?" "They were going to ask you to co-sign a loan for Jonah. Some kind of business expansion thing. Margaret was telling Harlan that you get soft after toasts, and that if they made you feel like you had to prove yourself to the family, you'd be more likely to agree to help with financing." I sat there for a moment, letting that sink in. The poor in-law sign wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. It was psychological manipulation. They'd wanted me to feel small and grateful and desperate to prove that I belonged, so that when they eventually asked me to put my name on someone else's debt, I'd be emotionally primed to say yes. "Lydia," I said, "are you absolutely sure about this?" I heard Margaret say, and I quote, "Once he's feeling defensive about the money thing, he'll want to show us how generous he can be. We just need to make him feel like he has something to prove." The metal taste was back in my mouth, stronger this time. I'd thought the sign was just garden-variety snobbery, the kind of casual cruelty that rich people sometimes inflict on their social inferiors. But it wasn't casual at all. It was calculated. They'd sat down and planned out how to make me feel bad enough about myself that I'd agree to take on financial responsibility for someone else's business venture. "What kind of loan?" I asked. "Something about Jonah wanting to expand his consulting practice." I didn't hear all the details, but Margaret was saying something about how banks want co-signers for new business loans, and how you have good credit and steady income. Of course, because apparently, in addition to being the family's unpaid wedding planner, emergency contact, and personal bank, I was also supposed to be their loan guarantor. The gift that keeps on giving, financially speaking. They had this whole strategy, Lydia continued. Make you feel excluded, then make you feel like you could earn your way back into their good graces by helping with the loan. Margaret called it managing Marcus's expectations. Managing my expectations. Like I was some kind of financial resource that needed to be carefully handled to ensure maximum yield. Not a person with feelings and dignity, just a credit score with legs. "Jesus," I said, more to myself than to Lydia. "There's more," she said, and somehow her voice got even quieter. "Harlan was worried that you might say no if they just asked straight out. So they wanted to create a situation where saying no would make you look petty and vindictive. The idea was that after they'd made you feel bad about not being included, and then graciously allowed you back in, you'd feel obligated to prove your loyalty to the family. I leaned back in my chair and stared at my ceiling, trying to process the sheer audacity of what she was describing. They hadn't just humiliated me for fun. They'd humiliated me as part of a multi-step plan to manipulate me into taking on someone else's debt. The cruelty wasn't the point. It was the strategy. Lydia, why are you telling me this? Because what they did was wrong, she said simply. And because I figured you deserved to know that this wasn't just about wedding drama. They've been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Margaret kept talking about how they needed to soften you up before making the ask. Soften me up. Like I was a piece of meat that needed to be tenderized before cooking. I appreciate you calling, I said. I really do. For what it's worth, she added, I think you did the right thing walking away. Even before I heard about the loan thing, that sign was completely out of line. Nobody deserves to be treated like that, especially not by family. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, just thinking. The whole year started making sense in a completely different way now. All those small favors and emergency situations that had trained me to be the family's go-to problem solver. All those casual comments about money and class and how different our backgrounds were. All those little moments when they'd made me feel like I had to prove I belonged at IT had all been leading up to this. The moment when they'd asked me to put my financial future on the line for someone else's business dreams and expect me to say yes because I was so grateful to be included in their world. They'd studied me like I was some kind of lab experiment, figuring out exactly how to push my buttons to get the response they wanted. The poor in-law sign wasn't an insult. It was bait. They'd wanted me to feel desperate to prove them wrong, desperate to show that I was worthy of their respect, desperate enough to sign whatever papers they put in front of me. Well, they'd certainly learned something about me today. Just not what they'd expected that I got up and walked to my office, where I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote one sentence in the middle of the page. I am not a walking apology with a credit limit. Then I taped it to my computer monitor, where I'd see it every morning when I sat down to work. A little reminder of the day I learned the difference between being family and being a resource, and decided I was done being the latter. The really beautiful part was that their plan had actually worked, just not the way they'd intended. They had managed my expectations. They taught me to expect exactly nothing from them, which was probably the most valuable lesson anyone had ever given me. I woke up Sunday morning feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, which made sense considering I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling and replaying Lydia's phone call in my head. There's something uniquely exhausting about discovering that people you've been trying to help have actually been running a long con on you. It's like finding out your therapist has been taking notes for a tell-all book that my phone had accumulated another dozen messages overnight, ranging from Sophie's increasingly frantic voicemails to what appeared to be a group text from various relatives offering their own versions of damage control. I deleted most of them without reading, because honestly, I was done being lectured about family loyalty by people who'd just spent a year treating me like a walking ATM. But before I could move on with my life, I needed to do one thing. Not for revenge, not to hurt anyone, but because the truth has a way of getting twisted when it passes through too many people, and I wanted my version of events on the record. That I made coffee, sat down at my computer, and opened Facebook. I'm not usually one for social media drama. Most of my posts are pictures of food or complaining about the Yankees pitching, but this felt like one of those times when staying quiet would be the same as accepting blame for something I didn't do. The post I wrote was short, simple, and completely factual. Yesterday, I arrived at my sister-in-law's wedding venue to find my photograph attached to security instructions with the words, "Do not let the poor in-law in" written underneath. I left quietly and did not attend the wedding. For those asking vendors why various services were discontinued, deposits were paid on my credit, final balances were scheduled on my authorization, and legal permits were filed under my name. I have withdrawn all authorizations effective immediately. Please direct questions about payment and service arrangements to the bride's family. That was it. No editorializing, no emotional appeals, no attempts to make anyone look bad. Just the facts, laid out in the most neutral language I could manage. Though I did attach screenshots of some of the payment confirmations and vendor emails, because nothing shuts down speculation quite like actual documentation, that I hit post, and immediately felt that weird mix of relief and anxiety that comes with finally telling your side of a story. Part of me wanted to add more context, to explain about the loan scheme or the year of being taken for granted, but I figured the basic facts would speak for themselves. They did. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with comments and private messages. Most of them were from people I barely knew, friends of friends, distant relatives, co-workers from Sophie's job, expressing shock and outrage about the sign. Apparently, the idea of literally blacklisting someone from a family wedding was offensive to people across a pretty wide spectrum of political and social views. Holy shit, Marcus, they actually put that in writing? This from my buddy Dave, who'd met Sophie's family exactly once and had spent the entire evening making jokes about their obvious wealth. What kind of people do that to family? From my cousin Rita, who lived in Ohio and barely knew Sophie, but understood basic human decency. I would have burned the whole place down. From my coworker Jennifer, who was not known for her conflict avoidance strategies. But the comment that really got to me came from Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who'd been following my posts for years and always left the sweetest comments about my cooking experiments. Some people mistake kindness for weakness, dear. You did the right thing standing up for yourself. Around noon, I got a call from someone I didn't recognize. The caller ID said Tara Bloom, which didn't ring any bells until she introduced herself as a local blogger who covered social events and community news for some hyperlocal website I'd never heard of. Mr. Marcus, she said, I saw your Facebook post about yesterday's wedding incident, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to provide some additional context for a story I'm working on. My first instinct was to say no, because getting involved with bloggers and journalists seemed like a great way to turn a family dispute into a public circus. But then I thought about Lydia's phone call, about the deliberate manipulation and the loan scheme, and I figured maybe a little sunlight wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. What kind of context are you looking for? I asked. Well, I've been hearing from several people who were at the wedding, and there seems to be some confusion about exactly what happened and why services were discontinued. Some people are saying you left because of a misunderstanding, others are saying there was some kind of payment dispute. There was no payment dispute, I said. I paid everything I was supposed to pay. The issue was that I was told I wasn't welcome at the wedding, so I decided my money wasn't welcome either. Can you tell me more about how you were told you weren't welcome? So I did. I walked her through the whole thing. Arriving at the venue, seeing the sign, calling Sophie, driving home, withdrawing authorizations. I kept it factual, stuck to what actually happened, didn't speculate about anyone's motives or try to make anyone look worse than their actions already did. Do you have any documentation of the payments you made? She asked. I do, and I sent her redacted copies of the same receipts I'd posted on Facebook, showing months of deposits and payments for everything from catering to photography to venue fees. The story went live that afternoon on her blog, and by evening it had been picked up by a couple of other local news sites. Nothing huge. This wasn't exactly national news, but enough coverage that people started sharing it on social media with comments like, "Can you believe this?" and "What kind of family does this?" That's when Channel 7's Lena Park called. I'd seen her on the evening news for years, covering everything from local politics to human interest stories, and she had that no-nonsense reporter voice that made you feel like you were about to be either vindicated or completely destroyed. Mr. Marcus, I'm calling about the wedding incident that's been making rounds on social media. Would you be willing to make a brief statement on camera? On camera, I asked, because suddenly this felt like it was getting bigger than I'd intended. Just a short interview. People are talking about this story, and I think it would be helpful to hear directly from you about what happened and why you made the decision you did. I thought about it for about 30 seconds. On one hand, going on TV felt like escalating things beyond what was necessary. On the other hand, Sophie's family had apparently been telling people that I'd thrown some kind of tantrum over a harmless joke, and maybe it was time for a different narrative to get some airtime. Okay, I said, but I'm not interested in trashing anyone. I just want to tell my side of what happened. The interview was brief and straightforward. Lena asked me to explain the sequence of events, and I did. She asked why I'd withdrawn the payment authorizations, and I explained that if I wasn't welcome as a person, my money wasn't welcome either. She asked if I felt like my response was proportional to what had happened. Look, I said, looking directly into the camera, love without respect isn't love. It's extraction. For a year, I've been the person this family calls when they need problems solved or bills paid. But when it came time to actually include me in their celebration, They literally put my picture on a list of people who weren't allowed in. That tells you everything you need to know about how they really see me. The interview aired on the 6 o'clock news, right between a story about a local school board meeting and a feel-good piece about a dog that learned to skateboard. Nothing earth-shattering, but enough to get people talking. By bedtime, my Facebook post had been shared over 200 times, and I'd received dozens of messages from people sharing their own stories about being taken for granted by family members or in-laws. Apparently, the unpaid family ATM experience was more common than I'd realized. The weirdest part was how good it felt to have people validate that what had happened to me was actually wrong. For so long, I'd been gaslighted into thinking that my reactions were overblown, that I was being too sensitive, that I should just accept being treated poorly because that's how family works. But strangers on the internet were saying what my own family wouldn't, that no one deserves to be humiliated like that, especially not by people who are supposed to love them. It was a small victory, but sometimes small victories are enough. Monday morning brought a strange kind of calm to my life. For the first time in months, I woke up without immediately checking my phone for emergency texts from Sophie's family. No panic calls about vendor issues, no last-minute requests to handle some crisis that couldn't wait until normal business hours. Just my alarm clock, my coffee maker, and the blessed silence of a life where I wasn't anyone's unpaid emergency contact. I actually made it through my entire morning routine, shower, coffee, checking the news, before my phone started buzzing. But when it did, it wasn't the usual suspects. Instead, I had messages from people I'd forgotten were even connected to this whole mess. Sophie's college roommate, expressing shock about the story. A couple of vendors, thanking me for treating them professionally even while everything was falling apart. Even my own mother, who lived in Florida and had somehow caught wind of the situation through the mysterious network of information that connects all mothers everywhere. Marcus, her voicemail said, "I saw the news story online. That girl's family owes you an apology, and if they had any sense, they'd be grateful you handled this whole thing as gracefully as you did. Call me when you get a chance." It was nice to hear from someone who was unequivocally on my side, even if that someone was biased by the simple fact of having given birth to me. Work was weird. My coworkers had seen the story. Apparently, Jennifer had made sure everyone in the office knew about it. And I kept getting these sympathetic looks and awkward conversations where people tried to express support without directly trash-talking my wife's family. American workplace diplomacy at its finest. "That's rough, man," my supervisor Kevin said during our Monday morning check-in. "You holding up okay?" "I'm fine," I said, which was mostly true. "Just glad it's over." "Is it over?" Good question. I was hoping it was, but experience had taught me that Sophie's family wasn't great at accepting outcomes they didn't like. They were more the type to keep pushing until they either got what they wanted or exhausted everyone involved in the process. That I got my answer around 6 p.m. when I looked out my kitchen window and saw them coming up my front walk again. Same delegation as Saturday night, but somehow they looked even more deflated. Talia had traded her wedding dress for jeans and a sweater, but she was still carrying her bouquet like it was some kind of magic talisman that could fix everything. This time, I didn't make them wait on the porch. I opened the door before they could knock, partly because I wanted to get this over with and partly because I was curious about what their next strategy would be. "Marcus," Harlan said, stepping forward with the careful movements of a man who was about to ask for something he wasn't sure he'd get. "Thank you for seeing us. What can I do for you?" I asked, staying in the doorway because I wasn't ready to invite them in for a cozy chat. "We've been talking," Margaret said, "and we realized that things got out of hand this weekend. We want to make this right." "Okay," I said. "How do you plan to do that?" Talia held out her bouquet like she was making some kind of offering. The flowers were starting to wilt around the edges, which seemed appropriate for a peace treaty that was probably doomed from the start. "If you turn everything back on," Harlan said, "we'll apologize publicly. We can draft a statement together, something that acknowledges that the sign was inappropriate and that we're sorry for how everything was handled." I looked at the bouquet, which had probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month, and thought about the generator that had coughed to a stop, the band equipment being packed away, the bar lights going dark. All of that had happened on Saturday. It was Monday now. The wedding was over. The moment had passed, and they were still talking about turning things back on, like there was some kind of magical reset button I could push. Turn what back on? I asked. The wedding happened. It's over. We could have a reception, Talia said quickly. A do-over party. Just family and close friends. You could authorize the vendors again, and we could have the celebration we were supposed to have. Jonah, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke up. We could draft a statement together, he said, echoing Harlan. Something that makes it clear that we recognize what happened was wrong, and that we value you as part of the family. A statement. A do-over party. Public apologies. They were still thinking in terms of damage control and reputation management, still trying to find the right combination of words and gestures that would get them what they wanted. Let me ask you something, I said. Who printed that sign? The same silence as Saturday night. The same uncomfortable looks. The same complete inability to take responsibility for a decision that someone in their group had definitely made. It was a mistake, Margaret said finally. A stupid joke that went too far. Who printed it? Does it matter? Sophie asked, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. We're here to fix this, not to assign blame. It matters to me, I said, because someone sat down, typed those words, printed them out, and handed them to security. That wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. That was a decision, and I want to know who made it. More silence, more uncomfortable shifting, more evidence that accountability wasn't really part of their vocabulary. Look, I said, I appreciate that you drove over here again. I really do. But here's the thing. You can't unring a bell. You can't take back something like that with apologies and do-over parties. So what do you want? Harlan asked, and there was genuine frustration in his voice now. What would it take for you to forgive this and move forward? I stared at him for a long moment. This man who had spent the last year treating me like a convenient resource, who had apparently planned to manipulate me into co-signing someone else's business loan, who was now standing on my porch asking what it would cost to buy my forgiveness. I want you to imagine, I said slowly, that this had nothing to do with me. Imagine you're planning an event and you need to pay vendors and get permits and handle logistics. Imagine you're adults who can solve problems without expecting someone else to fund your mistakes. But Marcus, Talia said, your family. No, I said, and the word came out harder than I'd intended. Family doesn't put each other's pictures on blacklists. Family doesn't spend a year taking someone for granted and then act surprised when that person finally stops being available for exploitation. We never exploited you, Margaret protested. Really? What would you call asking someone to handle all your emergencies, pay your deposits, solve your problems, and then publicly humiliating them when they show up to the event they've been funding? They didn't have an answer for that either. I'm not your villain, I continued, and I'm not your savior. I'm simply done. Before they could respond, I told them about the band, the photographer, and the other vendors, how I'd paid them something for their wasted time out of my own pocket, because working people shouldn't have to suffer for other people's pride. It felt important that they knew I hadn't left innocent people hanging, even if I'd left their family to figure out their own mess.as for the rest of it. The apologies, the do-over parties, the public statements. I wished them peace and stepped back inside. The lock turned with a small, honest sound that somehow felt like the most decisive thing I'd done in years. The next few weeks were probably the weirdest of my entire adult life. You know how when you quit a job you hate, there's this strange period where you keep waking up at the wrong time and reaching for your phone to check emails that aren't your problem anymore? It was like that, except instead of a job, I'd quit being the designated family crisis manager for a group of people who'd never actually wanted me around in the first place. The internet, predictably, lost its collective mind for about 4 days and then moved on to being outraged about something else. That's the beautiful thing about social media drama. It burns hot and fast, and then everyone finds a new shiny object to focus on. But for those 4 days, I was apparently the poster child for standing up to entitled in-laws, which was surreal but not entirely unpleasant that I got interview requests from 3 different podcasts, all of which I politely declined because I wasn't trying to build a media career out of family dysfunction. A couple of wedding planning blogs wanted to use my story as a cautionary tale about managing family dynamics, which seemed like missing the point entirely. And someone from Dr. Phil's show actually called, which was both hilarious and deeply concerning. The best part was the messages I got from complete strangers sharing their own stories. Apparently, the unpaid family ATM experience was practically universal. I heard from people who'd been funding their siblings' lifestyles, covering their parents' emergencies, or bankrolling extended family events while being treated like second-class citizens. It was like discovering you're part of some secret club you never knew existed. One message in particular stuck with me. It was from a woman named Sarah in Oregon who wrote, "I spent 10 years being my family's emergency fund while they made jokes about my job and my apartment. Your story gave me the courage to finally say no. Thank you for showing me what boundaries look like." That hit me harder than all the social media outrage combined. The idea that my spectacularly dysfunctional weekend might have helped someone else recognize their own worth was worth every uncomfortable conversation and family dinner I'd never have to attend again. Sophie, meanwhile, had moved in with her parents temporarily while we worked things out.